Alright, so let's talk a little bit about Romanian language. Just some general info. It's a Romance language. Its closest living relative is Italian, although it's about 75% similar, at least as far as vocabulary is concerned, to other Romance languages. Um, we went over the history, and so obviously you see how that affects language. You know, it starts with the Dacian, and then the Vulgar Latin enters, and Dacian and Vulgar Latin combined make this the Proto-Romanian, the core of the language. As you know, Russians and as tribes come in and reside there, you get some Slavic, which makes up about 14% of the vocabulary. Words like Chias and Strashnik are introduced and remain. Lots of German influence, especially in the north and the west area. Words like Kartoff and Scheibe, which are pretty obviously German. Then you have, borrowing from locals over the years, just the general osmosis of language. For instance, get a little bit of Greek, the word pholos or use. Some Hungarian, understandably. For example, akeltui, which is to spend. Some Turkish, bakshish, which in Romanian means tip, and in Turkish means bribe, which is a funny thing. And there's a little sprinkling of Romani or Tsigan, basically Gypsy language. Like a lot of slang is based on Gypsy language. Like mishto means cool, when in Gypsy, in Romani it just means good. Romania has a pretty high concentration of Romani in there. So let's look at some examples stolen shamelessly from Wikipedia. Here's an excerpt from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and we're just going to use this as an example of ways in which Romania is very much a stitching together of its influences. Here's a translation heavy on the French and Italian. Toate ființele umane se nasc libere și egale în demnitate și în drepturi. Ele sunt înzestrate cu rațiune și cu știință și trebuie să se comporte unele față de altele în spiritul fraternității. So, let's get rid of the French and Italian words and replace them with either Romanian or Slavic, just so we can get a feel for the differences. So here's that same excerpt with Slavic loanwords and no French or Italian. Toate ființele omenești se nasc slobode și deopotrivă în destoinicie și în drepturi. Ele sunt înzestrate cu înțelegere și cuget și trebuie să se poarte unele față de altele în duh de frățietate. Okay, some minor changes, obviously a lot less romantic, a lot more Slavic. Now taking out the Slavic words, just go old school. So, toate ființele omenești se nasc nespuse și asemenea în prețuire și în drepturi. Ele sunt înzestrate cu înțelegere și cuget și se cuvine să se poarte unele față de altele după firea frăției. I apologize to any native speakers out there. My Romanian's a little bit rusty. Let's move on to grammar. So with nouns, it's very standard, changes based on gender, masculine, feminine, neutral, number, single, plural. There's different cases, nominative, accusative, genitive, dative, vocative. One difference between Romanian and the other Romance languages is that definite articles are enclitic. They go at the end of the word, whereas indefinite articles are not. They go at or proclitic, I believe is the term. They go at the beginning of the word. So you have, take the word man, om. A man, un om. The man, omul. So it's similar to German in that way. Verbs, we're not going to talk about verbs today. That's ridiculous. On to basic structure. We're not going to get too deep into this. I just kind of want to give you a feel for how the parts go together. The best way to think about it is the core and everything else. The core is where the verbs and the pronouns go. And it's pretty inflexible in structure. If you change this up too much, you'll be pretty unintelligible. There are exceptions, of course, but we're not going to talk about those either. So, for example, you give, die. Uldai, you give it. Ildai, you give it to him. Throw in a tense in there. Aidat, you gave. Laidat, you gave it. Eli dat, you gave it to him. Again, this is relatively inflexible, whereas everything else is very flexible. This is where the nouns, the adjectives, the prepositions, the conjunctions, demonstrative pronouns, stressors, all that stuff goes. It's very flexible because Romanian, well, it's very flexible for lots of reasons, but Romanian doesn't have a whole lot of native words. As we saw earlier, they are starting to borrow a lot of words, but it's not the biggest lexicon in Romance language. So they kind of compensate by having placement in the whole phrase indicate a lot of meaning as opposed to the words chosen. Also, it means that every word has a whole lot of different uses and interpretations and meanings. They even have these overt stressors. So even if you use a direct object pronoun and an indirect object pronoun, even if you have them directly in the sentence, even if you don't use a pronoun, even if you use the actual word, you can still add a stressor. So for example, back to the you gave it to him. So if you say il a dat pe el, that's putting the emphasis on you gave that to him, or you gave it to him. Il a dat lui, you gave it to him. Il a dat tu, you gave it to him. And it gets more complex after that. Even without stressors, the general rule of thumb is whatever ends up closest to the end of the sentence receives the stress, and so you can play around with word order as long as you don't mess with the chord too much. I was going to give you a little bit example of just some uninterrupted Romanian speech by reading Mihai Eminescu, generally considered to be Romania's most accomplished poet. Reading Eminescu's Luceafărul, which is a story about how a young woman falls in love with the morning star, and how the morning star comes and woos her. But I found a video on YouTube of an actual native speaker, so you can enjoy that a little bit more than you would listening to me. Here's Luceafărul, the first 5 stanzas or so.
Luceafărul. A fost odată ca-n povești, a fost ca niciodată, din rude mari împărătești o prea frumoasă fată. Și era una la părinți și mândră în toate cele, cum e fecioara între sfinți și luna între stele. Din umbra falnicelor bolți ia pasul și îl îndreaptă lângă fereastră, unde în colț Luceafărul așteaptă. Privea în zare cum pe mări răsară și străluce pe mișcătoarele cărări, corăbii negre duce. Îl vede azi, îl vede mâini, astfel dorința-i gata. El iar privind de săptămâni îi cade dragă fată.